The unimaginable destruction of Jerusalem, the tragedy that changed the destiny of the Jewish people and the world forever. In 70 AD, the world witnessed one of the most devastating events in history: the fall of Jerusalem. The holy city, the beating heart of Jewish faith and culture, was reduced to ashes by the mighty Roman legions. The temple, the eternal symbol of the covenant between God and his people, was brutally destroyed, leaving the Jews without their spiritual center and plunging them into an exile that would scatter them throughout the world. This catastrophe marked not only the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new reality, where the faith and identity of a people were forged in the flames of destruction. The fall of Jerusalem was more than just a historical event. It was a deep wound that echoed through the centuries, shaping the survival, resistance, and renewal of a people who refused to disappear. This is the story of how an unimaginable tragedy became a symbol of eternal hope and indomitable resilience. Prepare to be taken on a journey of pain, faith, and transformation, where the past meets the present and redefines the future. Jerusalem, with its narrow streets and the scent of spices in the air, has always been a beacon of faith and tradition for the Jewish people. Dominated by successive empires over the centuries, from the Babylonians to the Persians and finally the Romans, the city remained the spiritual heart of Judaism. However, under Roman rule, tensions began to grow intensely and steadily. The Roman Empire, in its quest to maintain control over its vast provinces, imposed heavy taxes and a military government that often disregarded the religious sensibilities of the Jews. The situation became untenable when the Roman emperor began to impose his divine authority over all the lands under his control, including Judea. For the Jews, who believed in one God and were fiercely independent in their faith, the idea of worshiping or even acknowledging the divinity of the emperor was unthinkable and sacrilegious. The trigger for the revolt came when the Romans began to openly violate the traditions and sacred space of the temple in Jerusalem, imposing their military presence there, something that deeply offended the Jewish population. Amidst this atmosphere of growing frustration and oppression, factions emerged that began to openly question Roman rule. Among them, the Zealots stood out for their fierce determination to fight against foreign occupation, even if it meant direct and suicidal confrontation with the Roman legions. The idea of martyrdom for the faith and the liberation of their holy land gained traction, especially among young Jews who were tired of decades of oppression. The whispers of rebellion quickly turned into cries of war. Zealot leaders began to organize attacks on Roman garrisons and to gather a resistance army. War was imminent, and Jerusalem, with its imposing walls and its sacred temple, would be the final battleground. The Romans, realizing the gravity of the situation, mobilized an overwhelming military force to crush the revolt, led by General Vespasian and later by his son Titus. What began as a series of minor revolts soon escalated into an all-out war, with the fate of Jerusalem and the entire Jewish people hanging in the balance. The Jewish revolt against Rome was not just a battle for political freedom. It was an existential struggle for the identity, faith, and survival of an entire nation. Jerusalem, as the symbol of this struggle, was about to face one of the darkest chapters in its history. The year was 70 AD, and Jerusalem, the holy city, was besieged by one of the most powerful military forces in the ancient world. Titus, son of Emperor Vespasian, led the Roman legions, which were advancing relentlessly toward the city walls. The siege of Jerusalem was not just a military engagement. It was a meticulously planned operation to break the spirit and resilience of a people who refused to give in. As the Roman legions closed in, the situation inside Jerusalem deteriorated rapidly. The city, already overwhelmed by the arrival of thousands of refugees fleeing Roman fury in other parts of Judea, began to feel the effects of the siege. Food and water supplies were cut off, and famine soon spread through the narrow, densely populated streets. Desperation led to factions emerging within the city itself, further dividing the population. The Zealots, determined to fight to the last man, would not allow any form of surrender, even attacking their compatriots who advocated negotiation with the Romans. Meanwhile, outside the walls, The Roman legions erected imposing siege towers and catapults, ready to hurl their deadly missiles at the city. The Roman engineers, renowned for their skill in siege warfare, worked tirelessly to weaken Jerusalem's defenses. The walls, which had protected the city for centuries, now became a battlefield, with every stone bearing witness to the fury and desperation of the conflict. Inside Jerusalem, the situation grew worse by the day. The famine became so severe that reports of cannibalism began to emerge, with families struggling to survive at any cost. The temple, which was supposed to be a sanctuary of peace and prayer, was transformed into a fortress by the Zealots, who fiercely defended it against any attempt at invasion. The holy city, once a symbol of faith and hope, was now plunged into darkness and despair. Attempts by small groups of desperate fighters to break the siege were quickly crushed by the disciplined Roman legions. Titus, determined to subdue the city without completely destroying the temple, ordered surgical strikes to weaken Jewish resistance. However, the stubborn resistance of the defenders and the brutality of the battles transformed Jerusalem into a field of death and destruction. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, as the siege continued relentlessly. The city, now in ruins, was a scene of horror and suffering. The screams of the wounded and dying echoed through the deserted streets, while the few survivors hid in the shadows, waiting for the inevitable end. The temple, which had been the beating heart of Jerusalem, was about to meet its final fate. The siege of Jerusalem was not just a military campaign. It was an attempt to annihilate an identity and a faith. The city, which had held out for so long, was now on the brink of total collapse. Complete destruction was at hand, and with it, the fall of one of the greatest symbols of Judaism. The temple in Jerusalem, with its towering columns and vast courtyards, has always been the spiritual center of Jewish life. For centuries, it had been the place where Jews from all over the world came to pray, offer sacrifices, and connect with God. For the Jewish people, the temple was not just a building. It was the symbol of their faith, their identity, and their covenant with their Creator. Yet in 70 CE, this sacred symbol would face total destruction. As the siege of Jerusalem intensified, the temple became the last stronghold of the city's defenders. The Zealots, determined not to surrender to the Romans, turned the temple into a fortress. The battles around and within the temple were fierce, with the defenders fighting desperately, knowing that the fall of the temple would mean the end of their resistance and, for many, the end of their faith. Titus, aware of the importance of the temple to the Jews, initially wanted to spare the building from destruction. He knew that preserving the temple could help bring peace to the Jewish people after the Roman victory. However, the brutality of the battles, the stubborn resistance of the defenders, and the chaos that had ensued in the city made this intention increasingly difficult to maintain. The temple, which was supposed to be a place of peace and worship, was now at the center of a violent and desperate war. Amid the chaos of the recent battles, a Roman soldier, acting on his own, threw a torch into the temple. Flames quickly engulfed the building, fueled by the flammable materials used in its construction. The fire spread uncontrollably, consuming everything in its path. The screams of the defenders echoed through the halls as they tried in vain to save what they could. The temple, which had withstood the test of time and adversity, was now succumbing to the destructive power of the fire. As the flames engulfed the temple, many of those who still resisted were massacred by the Roman legions. The destruction was complete, with not a stone left standing. What had once been a symbol of faith and hope was now nothing more than a smoldering ruin. For the Jews who survived, the sight of the temple in flames was a devastating blow, a sign that their connection to God had been broken and their national identity destroyed. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem marked the end of an era for the Jewish people. Without the temple, Jewish religious practices had to be drastically transformed. The centralization of worship in Jerusalem and the sacrificial system were replaced by new forms of worship and study, led by the rabbis who emerged as the people's new spiritual guides. Judaism shifted from a religion centered on the temple to a faith based on Torah and community. For the world at large, the destruction of the temple was a profound event. Not only did it mean the end of one of the greatest symbols of Judaism, but it also had profound implications for the identity and survival of the Jewish people. The loss of the temple sparked a diaspora that scattered Jews throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, forcing them to preserve their faith and culture in new, often hostile lands. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE was not just a tragedy for the Jewish people. It was a turning point in world history. The scars left by this event were profound, shaping the history of Judaism and the West for centuries. The temple, though physically destroyed, remained alive in the memories and hearts of the Jewish people as an eternal symbol of their faith and resilience. With the destruction of the temple and the final fall of Jerusalem, the Jewish people faced a period of unprecedented devastation and desolation. The city, which had once been the spiritual, political, and cultural center of Judaism, was now in ruins. The Roman legions, after months of brutal siege, left behind a scene of total destruction. The few survivors of Jerusalem were captured or forced into exile, marking the beginning of a dispersion that would shape the future of Judaism forever. The diaspora that followed the fall of Jerusalem represented one of the most traumatic moments in the history of the Jewish people. Deprived of their temple, the central symbol of their faith and identity, the Jews were forced to find new ways to maintain their religiosity and culture. Religious practice, which had previously centered on the temple and sacrifices, had to adapt to the new reality of a landless people scattered across various regions of the Roman Empire. This transformation gave rise to Rabbinic Judaism, which placed emphasis on the Torah, the study of Scripture, and communal life. Synagogues began to emerge as new centers of worship and learning, replacing the temple as the gathering place of the Jewish faith. Rabbis, with their profound scholarship and spiritual leadership, emerged as the new religious authorities, guiding the Jewish people in their spiritual and cultural survival amid the diaspora. In addition to religious changes, the fall of Jerusalem had a profound impact on Jewish identity. The destruction of the city and the temple was seen by many as a sign of divine displeasure, leading to a period of intense spiritual reflection and re-evaluation. Suffering and dispersion became central themes in Jewish narrative, shaping the literature, prayers, and theology of the people. The social impact of the destruction of Jerusalem was also significant. The diaspora forced Jews to integrate into new societies, often facing hostility and persecution. However, this dispersion also resulted in the spread of Judaism throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, establishing Jewish communities as far away as Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. These communities became hotbeds of cultural and religious resistance, preserving Jewish traditions and values in the face of adverse circumstances. The fall of Jerusalem also influenced the perception of the Jewish people by other cultures and religions. Christianity, which was emerging as a new religious force at the time, interpreted the destruction of the temple as a confirmation of its own theology and mission. For Christians, the fall of Jerusalem symbolized the end of the Old Covenant and the beginning of a new spiritual era. However, for Jews, the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile were seen as proof of their resilience and of God's eternal covenant with His people. Even without the temple, the Jewish faith was not destroyed. Rather, it adapted, survived, and continued to thrive despite adversity. The diaspora, while painful, became a central part of Jewish identity, uniting the people around a common story of resistance and renewal. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE was not just a historical event. It became a pivotal milestone in the collective memory of the Jewish people and in the history of the world. Over the centuries, the destruction of the temple and the devastation of Jerusalem have been remembered with sadness, but also with a deep sense of identity and purpose. The memory of the fall of Jerusalem has been preserved in prayer, tradition, and literature, serving as a constant reminder of the resilience and perseverance of the Jewish people. One of the most powerful ways in which the fall of Jerusalem has been kept alive in Jewish memory is through Tisha B'Av, a day of fasting and mourning that commemorates the destruction of the two temples in Jerusalem. On this day, Jews around the world come together to mourn the loss of their holy city and to reflect on the spiritual lessons that can be learned from this tragedy. Tisha B'Av is not only a remembrance of a past event, but also a day of introspection and spiritual renewal, reinforcing the Jewish people's eternal connection to Jerusalem. In addition to religious practices, the fall of Jerusalem had a profound impact on Jewish literature and art. The destruction of the temple was a recurring theme in religious texts, hymns, and poetry, which expressed both the pain of loss and the hope of redemption. This literature helped to keep the faith and identity of the Jewish people alive during the centuries of exile and dispersion, serving as a source of inspiration and solace. The memory of the fall of Jerusalem also had a lasting impact on Jewish theology. Jewish rabbis and thinkers interpreted the destruction of the temple as an opportunity to reflect on the people's relationship with God and to reaffirm the core values of the Jewish faith. The loss of the temple was seen not only as divine punishment but also as a call to spiritual renewal and the rediscovery of the true essence of Judaism. For the world at large, the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple had profound implications. The Jewish diaspora that followed helped spread Jewish culture, religion, and values throughout the world, influencing Western civilization in profound and lasting ways. Jerusalem, even in ruins, remained a powerful symbol of faith, resilience, and hope for millions of people around the world. The fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE was an event that shaped the history of a nation and a faith. The destruction of the temple and the ensuing diaspora did not mean the end of Judaism, but the beginning of a new era of renewal and adaptation. The memory of this event continues to resonate in the lives and faith of the Jewish people, reminding us all of the importance of resilience, hope, and faith in times of adversity.